All right, good morning. Today we're going to go over Chapter 4. We did Chapter 5 yesterday. I did produce it. I forgot to put it out on YouTube. I'll do that by the end of the period today. But we're going to go over Chapter 4. This is the plan. Between now and probably around 9 o'clock, we'll go over Chapter 4. Okay, including the two programs that are at the end of the chapter. After that, then we'll take a break. We'll get a break in there somewhere. And I've got two calculator programs that I've created that I'm going to send you, and then we're going to go over those. I was just going to give you the hard copies, but I thought, this is baloney. I don't want to print out 8 hard copies, and then you're always switching back and forth between stuff, etc. So I'm just going to give you the code. All right. So I'm on page, looks like 111, Chapter 4. How to work with JavaScript objects, functions, and events. There actually are 3 different parts to this chapter. So they're going to talk about objects. What they're starting to do in this chapter is they're starting to bring this back around towards talking about web pages. All right. So as it says, they will talk about text box and number objects, date and string objects. Okay. Now, I have said this to you before, but I can't say it to you too many times, and that is that really, when you start to look through this stuff, and I'm going to see, I used to have this really fantastic site that I would put in there and show people that would show you all the different JavaScript methods for strings and for arrays and for functions, etc. Then they took the site down. Don't know why, but they just never brought it back up. But one of my students, this was about 3 years ago, he sent me an email and he said, you know what, they did put it down, but they archived it. So it is still out there, but I've lost that address. I'm going to go look for it today. But if you go out to, developer.mozilla.org, and I don't want that. I just want developer.mozilla.org. All right. And they have out here, it's someplace, you might have to go look for it, I don't know. It might be just here under JavaScript, I don't really, there you go. That is probably today the quintessential place to go look for things. So if you're working on something and you just can't figure out how to do something, many times if you're going to go out and Google, that's what it's going to give you, or that'll either be the first thing or one of the first things. Plus, and you all know this already, under w3schools.com, if you go to tutorials and you go to JavaScript, learn JavaScript, they're going to have it in there too. So all the stuff that we're talking about, really all the stuff we have talked about, and all of the stuff that we're talking about today, you can find in one of those sites or the other one. All right? Okay, let me jump back then. So we'll talk first, like I said, about different kinds of objects. And believe it or not, you've already worked with some of these. All right? Then we'll get into functions. Now, the only function that we've used thus far has been main. I think you'd all agree with that. But what you're going to see in these two calculator programs, and I think in the programs at the end of the chapter, is what you really should do is rather than putting everything in main, you should break it up into smaller units. What does that do? Well, first of all, what that does is if you have a lot of people working on a project, you can give each one of those units to a different person, conceivably. All right. Now, they have to all be able to come together, but you get hopefully what I'm talking about. So if you've got a very complex app, so imagine what they created for like Amazon. You're not going to have one person who's going to do all that. So if you break it up into units, I mean, it works out much better that way. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, JavaScript allows you to do things with functions that not too many other languages do. They're very liberal in some of the stuff they let you do. So we're going to talk about this, and you're going to see some of it, all right? And some of it may make sense, and some of it, if you haven't read the chapter, probably would be a good idea to do so. Then we'll get into event handling. And I think I mentioned this the other day. If you imagine, so far, believe it or not, you've done event handling, even if you don't realize it. We have created forms where the form has had a submit button and the form has had a reset button or a clear button or whatever. And those buttons are automatically programmed in for you, for lack of better words, in JavaScript. But if you've got other buttons, and just to show you, I think I've got it up here someplace. Let me see. There it is. Okay, yeah, keep it here. All right. I don't want to get too much off track, but I do want to show you something here. This is what I'm going to send you in just a bit. If I remember what I called it. Oh, I gave it today's date. That's right. That's it there. Okay, so we're going to look at two different calculators in just a bit. The first one is kind of what you're used to seeing already. In other words, so I come in here, I run this, and it's got alerts. Give me a number. 23. Give me another number. 14. And I just literally program that in. Is that pretty obvious what that's doing? All right. Well, the second one is more, I don't want to do it anymore. The second one is a little bit more like what you'd actually probably try to program. And we're going to, again, you're going to have the code for this in just a minute, but see this? It looks, it looks more like something that you'd want to use, in my opinion. First of all, you may or may not be able to tell, but when I click in here, I made both these fields type number, which means if I try to type in letters, it doesn't take them. And that's good. But now if I come in and I do the same thing, and I've got, first of all, if I try to do one of these operations here, and I don't put a number in, I get error messages. Should make sense. All right, numeric input required. All right, so if I leave them blank, I have to either put in a number or it's going to be blank because it's a number field. Now, this is going to take negative numbers. I could check for that, but I didn't. Calculators take negative numbers. But I'll put in here again, 23, and I'll put in here 14. Now I can add them, subtract, multiply, divide, modulo, and clear. So that's looking, I think at least, a little bit more like the type of application that you would think of building. In other words, when you think of the website, let's just suppose, she doesn't want it, but let's suppose for the Arrow Bridge Rescue, Ms. Kincaid wanted a calculator. You could build something like that. All right, just as an example. So we're going to look at that in just a bit. All right. So again, the chapter ends. So we talk about how to wire up. So when you click a button, and it doesn't have to be a button. You can do a click event on virtually anything. If you wanted to set a click event on a text box, you can do that. If you want to set a click event on a form, you can do that. There's double click events. Towards the end here, they show you a big chart with all the different events that you can go and wire up, all right, on your page. And then the chapter ends, as it says, with these two illustrative applications. So they go back to the miles per gallon, and they go back to the email list. You've seen both these applications before. All right, okay. So they say back in chapter 2, you learned about prompt and alert. Basically, so far, that's all we've been using. Those both, prompt and alert, are what are referred to as window objects. What does that mean? That means that instead of saying prompt, you can say window.prompt. Instead of saying alert, you can say window.alert. All right, and what that means is there's an object called window, and one of the methods or one of the things you can do under window is prompt or is alert. Does that make sense? Window is what's called the default object in JavaScript, so you don't need to put window.prompt or window.alert. You can just say prompt or you can just say alert. Okay, and it works just fine. All right. There's also another one here that we haven't talked about yet. It's not used as often, but sometimes people like it, and it's called confirm. The difference between confirm and prompt is confirm has got a thing on there where you can cancel. All right, so it's got an OK button and a cancel button, and you can program the cancel button. So if somebody clicks cancel, you've got some control over what happens. Again, to be honest with you, in actual application JavaScript programming, you're probably never going to find alerts or prompts or confirms. We're just doing it now because we're getting our feet wet, so to speak, in how to use this. All right? Now, there's parse int and parse float. I'm not going to talk about those because we already have. You've been using those, and very well, in your program so far. This is the confirm here. Are you sure you want to delete it? All right, and it doesn't show the picture, but it would just bring up a box that would say that. All right, I warned you this was coming, so here it is. This is probably, overall, this is probably the most important thing for you to understand how to use this semester. Get element by ID. Now, if I am, let me go back to what I showed you before. So this is that calculator that we're going to look at, okay? But what I want to do is, for just a second, I want to bring up the HTML file. It's not really that much different from what you've seen before. You could probably all build this HTML file fairly quickly. All right, but what I want to show you, though, is this. Anything that's in here that I want to be able to manipulate programmatically has an ID. See that? So when you use get element by ID, that's what you give it. Is whatever one of those IDs you want to be able to manipulate, what it's holding or whatever. All right? If you don't know the difference between document.write and document.writeLine, what write does is it writes on the screen and it keeps the cursor basically on that line. Write line, whenever you see an LM on the end of one of these, it means after it writes it, it's like you hit enter, so you're down at the next line. When we get into the Java in a couple semesters, you'll be using print and print line. Okay, and C# also, you can use print and print line. Okay. So here's an example. It says var rate box equals document.getElement by ID rate. So somewhere on your page, you've got some element. I don't know what it is. We don't care. But that particular element is called rate. Now, quite often it'll be something like a text box because you want to be able to grab the value that's inside of a text box. That's what we want to do with a calculator, right? We want to grab number 1. We want to grab number 2. Okay? So we're grabbing that value and we're placing it into a local or a JavaScript variable called ratebox. Now, they don't show that here, but quite often, in fact, most of the time, you'll call the variable the same name, your JavaScript variable, the same name as the actual ID thing for the ID itself. You didn't have to do that. They're showing you that here. But more often than not, you'll say var rate equals document.getElement by ID rate. Does that make sense? You don't have to do it though, but most people do. That's all I'm saying. All right. Now, I want you to see this. So notice what they've done right here. It says document.write today is, okay, everybody see this? Okay. So what that is going to do is it's literally going to write something out along the lines of today is, it's either going to say October 27th, 2020, or it's going to say like 10/27/20, etc. Why is that an important thing? All right. So when we look here, as it says, we already talked about the window object. All right. You've also seen the document object. You've seen this already. Document.write. You've already done this. You were asked to do this on either assignments or tests or both. Now, document, notice what it says. It's the object that lets you work with what's called the DOM. And what are we in here? I think it's chapters 6. Really more chapter 6 is all on the DOM. What the DOM says is it allows you to take anything in JavaScript that you give an ID to and manipulate it programmatically. And even some stuff you don't necessarily give IDs to, but most everything you give an ID to. You want to change the background color of a screen, you want to change the text color, you want to change the font size or type, you want to do it while the program's running, you can do that. That's what we'll get into in a couple weeks. All right? So, It says data in a text box is returned as a string. That's one thing that I want you to understand. Even when we've been using prompts, the reason we have to use parse int in there is because if I put 37, if I put a 37 in there in the prompt, it's not 37. It's the string 37. That string has no arithmetic value whatsoever. So unless I do a parse int on it and convert it to a number, if I try doing an operation with it, it's going to think it's 0 or NaN. Does that make sense? All right. You already know what NaN is. And again, the get element by ID is commonly used to get the object for an HTML element. The other thing is there's a shortcut for using get element by ID. We're going to talk about that a little later on in the chapter here. Not only are we going to talk about it, it's going to be expected that you're going to use that. All right. All right, so how to use text box and number objects. All right, so we're going to look at this right now, and let's take a look at the examples that are in here. Hopefully, the first one that's there, focus, makes sense to you. If I want to go and put the cursor in a certain field, I give that field the focus. So, for example, and we didn't really do much of this, but what we could have done back in chapter 13, I think it was, of the other book, when we learned how to use forms, is we could have taken that first form field and made sure that at the beginning of the program, the focus was set to that field. Now, if it's the first one that you put in, by default, it will be set there, but it never hurts. All right? Okay. Notice the text boxes have two properties. They have a property called value and one called disabled. Now, from what I showed you before, and where is that? On here, you may or may not be able to tell, but look at answer. You notice that it's gray? Can you tell that? Can you tell that, Jameer, from back there? Okay, Connor, can you tell that from back there? Okay, that's been disabled because I don't want to put a 34 in here, a 12 in here, click the plus button and be able to change that answer because 34 plus 12 is 46. Period. All right, so that's an example of disabled. When I grab this, if I want to grab what's in there, that's value. Make sense? All right. The to fixed we've already used. You've already done that, where you can use to fixed 2 to give something 2 decimal places, etc. So I don't really think we have to talk about that. But let's look at this. All right. So we're assuming here we've got two text boxes. One that's called first name, one that's called sales amount. All right. And then they come in here and notice the difference. These two lines right here do exactly the same thing as this line right here. In the second case, they combine the commands together. That's known as chaining the commands. That'll become really important in about a month or so when we get into talking about jQuery. Because jQuery chains everything. All right. So if I want to, for example, if I want to fade something in and I want to change its color and I want to move it around on the screen, I'll say dot this, dot that, dot another thing, etc. That's chaining. All right. So here we're not chaining. We're just saying grab. So go out and find the element with an ID of first name. So it knows to grab that one. Does that make sense? And we're throwing it into a variable called first name. I don't like the fact, one of the things I don't like about this book is notice, and they'll even say, well, for the JavaScript variables, we run them together, and for our forms right here, we don't, so you can tell them apart. You want to do that, that's fine. All right, I guess as long as you come up with a standard and you stick to it, then that's fine. All right, then they're saying grab the value that was in that text box and put it into first name. Do these two lines right here make sense to everyone? What's going on? This one is saying, again, associate that ID, so that field, with the JavaScript variable first name. The second one is saying grab the value that's in it and put it into first name. It's kind of like, when we've done this kind of thing before where you've said like int age, then on the next line you say age equal 21, and I said you can combine those into int age equal 21. Well, we're doing the same type of thing right here. But now notice here, we're doing it just in one thing. So we've combined the commands together. Again, that's referred to as chaining. Now, the parse float, I'm not going to go over that because I think you know that already. Okay? Now, when we look over here, notice they're combining a bunch of stuff here. So what are they doing? They're saying sales amount. They're trying to parse float. And what are they parse floating right here? What's in that text box, its value. You see this? What we've been doing in the past is we've been doing a prompt and putting something in. All right? Now we're actually saying we've got something on a web page. We've got a field on a web page that's called sales amount. We want to use whatever you put into that text box for sales amount. All right, so find that, grab its value, take its value, all right, take its value and set it to 2 decimal places, then copy it over, make sure it's a float, and copy it over to sales amount. Now, if I put hello in there, it's still going to be NAN. Does that make sense? All right. But I've already shown you this when I showed you the example before that I'm going to send you later, that if you set the type to number in a text box, that's not going to happen. You set it to number, and you could even put a default value in there, or you can check and say if it is empty, put a default value in there. All right. And then you're always protected. Okay. So then here they're grabbing, notice what they're doing here. They're clearing a text box. You will be expected to know how to clear things, all right, when you take your test. And here they're setting the focus. All right. I don't think there's anything in here we haven't already talked about. When you assign a numeric value to a variable, you create what's called a number object. It's not that big a thing because it happens behind the scenes. You don't really even see that it's happening. So, how to use date and string objects. Strings are basically anything, what you can kind of look at it this way, anything that has a value in it, that's not a Boolean, and that's not a number, is a string. Does that make sense? All right. Because JavaScript, even though it does associate between parse int and parse float, looks at every number as being a number. You can put numbers in a lot of different formats, a lot of which we haven't even looked at. You can put them in a binary format, which is base 2. You can put them into hexadecimal format, which is base 16. You can put them into scientific format or into logarithmic type of format. You can do all that stuff. We don't really need to, but you can. All right. Now, notice what are they doing here? They're creating a brand new date object in that line right here. var today equals new date. That will create a new date object. Once you've got that, you can run any of these things on there. So notice, assuming that today was March 9th, 2017, and I know it's not, so just plug in today's date instead. All right. But notice what you can do. You can set this up, and there's even more formats than this. Again, if you go out to one of the 2 resources I gave you at the beginning of class, equal either developer.mozilla.org/JavaScript, or you go out to W3 Schools, you can find all the different methods that you can use with dates. All right. So, for example, hint, if you were taking a test and you were asked to put a date on your web page in a certain format, all right, you could go out to one of those. You probably could even just Google it, but if you Google it more often than not, one of the first things that's going to be shown, if not the first, is either going to be W3 Schools or it's going to be developer.mozilla.org. All right? All right. Strings have a length. What's a length? It's how many characters are in there. So if I created a variable, let's say that I created a variable. I said, let greeting equals double quote hello, double quote. You with me? And then I asked for the length of greeting. It's going to give me HELLO. It's going to give me 5. That can be really important because if you want to make sure that, for example, that a user only puts in 1 character or you want to throw the rest away. Now, I showed you that charet thing that we used where, you asked the person, do you want to run the program again, yes or no, and we only plucked off the first character, all right, and which is fine. But sometimes you want to make sure that something is either a minimal length or doesn't exceed a maximum length. So you can use the length property to do that. All right. Here are some other ones. Typically, when you are working with strings, what you want to know is, does the string contain something? For instance, This is probably a crummy example, but I'm going to give it anyway. Let's assume that I have a variable that literally holds the Constitution of the United States. It'd be pretty big. But let's assume I've got that. I've got a variable with a string in it, and boom, it holds everything. And I want to know all the times in there, because we want to be totally gender neutral. So we want to know how many times in there do they say man. Because my guess is if you checked how many times they say woman, it would be 0 or very few. But if we want to change every instance of man to people, let's say, we could do something like that. All right? So notice index of. Searches for the first occurrence of a string. When you want a string that's within a string, it's called a substring. Does that make sense? So if I used my name, Jeffrey Paul Scott, and I wanted to know if there were 2 T's in there, all right, I could do an index of, and it would show me the position of where those 2 T's were. Now, by default, it searches in a positive direction. But you can also search in a negative direction. So you can search from beginning to end or end to beginning. All right, a substring is just that. Now notice with this, if it doesn't find what it's looking for, it returns -1. See that? So -1 is usually a value meaning, I don't know what it is. All right. Substring, again, is a string within a string. And notice there's sub-str and there's substring. Well, let's look at these. Returns the substring that starts at the specified position, counting from 0, and stops at a certain position. That one just says, and contains a specified number of characters. You pretty much use these in the same way. All right. 2 lowercase we've already looked at. Takes whatever the string is and makes it all lowercase. 2 uppercase does just the opposite. All right. So again, they've got some examples here. I'm not going to go through those because they give you exactly what it'll look like. All right, that's the first part. So let's jump into functions. So let's, and I'm going to jump back and forth between these, but I'm going to go, for now, I'm going to go over to, let's see, this simpler example. Calculator simple, JS calculator. All right. Now, you'll notice I made this a while ago. So one thing I should do before I give it to you is I should come in here and do a Control F, and I should say var, and I should replace all those vars. In fact, I'll say var space like that with let. See that? And hopefully, well, I don't know if I screwed it up. Oh, there it is. Replace all. All right. So hopefully those have all been replaced. Again, we're going to be talking about in a bit the difference between var and let. Var allows you to be really cheesy with the way you code. The other thing is, as I told you, I should have put up here, use strict. Again, please get used to putting that up here at the top. Makes you a better programmer because it makes for better programs. All right, so what do we have here? Well, you can see these. Number 1, number 2, sum, diff, prod, quote, mod. My question is there anything in there that doesn't make sense to people? Notice I even put comments in there. All right. And again, just you want to run the program again, yes or no. First is the first character that you enter for the answer. You've seen all this before. The difference is when you look at this, what is it? It's about almost exactly 100 lines, okay? And if I go back to here, really it starts on here, so it's somewhere between 90 and 100 lines, all right? But what's different is here, when you look right there, that is, in fact, I can do it from the top, but you see the variables there. That's all the code in main. Main is now a driver. So we've got one routine that inputs the first number, another routine that inputs the second number, another routine that adds the 2 numbers, another routine that does a subtraction, another one that does a multiplication, another one that does a division, another one that does a modulus, another one that prints the answers. And although I didn't do it, we could have even taken this and put that in its own routine. Then main would have totally been a driver. It does have a little bit of executable code in here. But what we're doing here is we're saying call this function. It's called input number. Input number must return something. It must. Why? Because I'm stuffing it into number 1. Does that make sense? All right, so let's look at input number. You'll notice all these functions are real small. Let num equal parse. Enter a number. While it's not a number, we ask you to do it again. Does that make sense? Is there anything in that code that's in gray that you don't understand? When you get down to where you have a number, you return it. Now, I didn't mention this before, but I want you to look at this. Do you all see this? That's calling the same. That is calling the same routine, but it's it's sending the answer back into 2 different variables. Well, doesn't that make sense? Because if I ask you for a number and then I ask you for another number, why should I write 2 routines? I could have written a routine called input number 1 and another one called input number 2. That would have been a waste of time and code. Plus, if it changes for some reason, then I got to change it in two places. I don't want to do that. All right. Then look at these. Sum, diff, prod, mod. Let's just look at these right here. Notice, in order to be able to do the sum, the difference, the product, the quotient, and the modulus, those routines need that information. They need to know what the 2 numbers are. So we put those 2 numbers in parentheses. Everybody see that? Those are called parameters. We are passing number 1 and number 2 to each one of those routines. All right? Look at how small the routines are, by and large. Okay, there's the first 3. Return n1 plus n2, return n1 minus n2, return n1 times n2. Those are nice routines because they're very small. All right, we could have done those right in main. But what happens is main starts to grow and grow and grow and grow as your program gets more and more complex. And if there is an error, well, it's in there someplace, but I don't know, main's got 8,000 lines in it. You don't want that. I know if there's a problem with the addition, I know right where to go. All right. Now, if I put a minus in here, I'm not going to, but if I put a minus in there, I'd probably be able to tell real quick that I made a mistake, but that's a logic error that we talked about yesterday. All right. So notice in here too, what are they called? Number 1 and number 2, right? These are called actual parameters because that's their actual name. Right there. These in here, notice I didn't call them number 1 and number 2. I could have. I don't have to. These are called formal parameters. It's kind of almost the reverse of the way you think it would be. But actual, it's like if I use my name, you know, if my whole first name is Jeffrey, right? But down here I could say Jeff, and it would mean the same thing. All right? So again, we're adding 2 and returning it, subtracting 2 and returning it, multiplying 2 and returning it. Well, notice that quotient and modulo, both of them have got to check for 0. We don't want to allow you to divide by 0. All right, and I didn't do this, but when you look, tell me if this makes sense or if it doesn't. Please be honest. Look at these lines from lines 68 through 86. You see these 2 routines? Would you agree that other than when we're returning, that last return in there, they're the same thing? Would you agree with that? We could have actually written that as 1 routine. I could have combined them into 1, but then I would have had to pass in not just number 1 and number 2, but maybe a 1 if I wanted to do a divide, and a 2 if I wanted to do a modulo. Does that make sense? As a programmer, you should always be thinking about ways to make your code concise. Now, I've said this to you before. In your first year, you're programming for understandability, and that's still true. But what I'm talking about is you graduated from here, and now you're going out for your first job. All right? You probably then would want to start thinking about how can I really streamline my code to make it look, act, run better. You'd be amazed, because I've done it, when you go out to a lot of professional organizations, just how bad a lot of the code is. All right? But again, it works, so people don't fix it. right? Or if it breaks somewhere, they fix that part. But well, like, this could be no, don't rewrite that. Why? Because it works. People are always afraid. Companies are always afraid of you breaking code. And why? Think about it. If you remember a few years ago when people hijacked Amazon for a day, think about how much money they lost over that day. It was, I have no doubt, it was well into the millions. It could have been into the hundreds of millions. My wife was reading some article online yesterday, and she read it out to me that they said that, Bezos has made how many billions during the pandemic. So, people are still using this stuff. And a lot of people, that's how they're getting everything. Maybe, I don't know if Amazon even gives you groceries, but I know it's like my daughter. She's just recovering right now. She can go back to work today. She had COVID. All right. She's still, throughout this entire pandemic, she goes to Target, gets her groceries from there. All right. So then the last one that's here, notice this one. Now I'm passing everything, but there's a difference. For every one of these you see in gray, they have to return something because I'm stuffing it into the variable that's on the left. Make sense? The last one isn't returning anything. I'm still passing all this stuff because it needs number 1, number 2, the sum, the difference, the product, the quotient, and the modulus. It needs those things. But I'm not sending anything back. So it's not set equal to anything. So it's just a function call. All right? And if we look at that one, not really very hard. I just create a string. I call them N1, N2, sum, difference, product, quotient, modulus. And I'm just combining everything together. This isn't a true calculator. All right? But the idea was, what I was trying to show you here is how you can take any problem and break it up into a series of steps. That's what I want you to get out of this example that's right here. All right? Okay. So, when you start working with functions, one of the things that JavaScript does that most programming languages do not allow you to do, is to treat a function like a variable. In fact, you can take a variable and assign a function to it. That's what they're doing here. That means run the function. All right, and it's the statements that run when the function's executed. Once it executes, put the value into there. Most languages do not allow you to do that. There's a clear distinction between what variables are and what functions are, and there's like a line between them, not in JavaScript. So what do we have here? Show year. Okay, that's a variable. It's going to call this function. All right, or really it holds today equal new date, and the year is today.getFullYear. Well, you still have to call it. It doesn't automatically call itself, but when you type in show year like this, it says, oh, there it is. Call that function, set that variable, print that alert, all right, and basically that's what's going to go into here. Now, it's not, do you agree there's no return statement there? You agree with that? When you have no return, the return is actually undefined because there isn't any. But always something gets returned. Here in this case, literally undefined gets returned. And it doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't hurt anything at all. All right. Here's where it gets a little harder. Okay? And I don't expect this to make a whole heck of a lot of sense right now. In English, right here, this is the most important part of the lecture today. What we're saying is we don't want to have to be constantly typing document.getElementById and putting something in there. So what we're doing right here is we are aliasing this line of code with a $sign. So if you put that at the top of your JavaScript file, that means that any place that you were going to use a document.getElementById, and let's say like they showed before, what do they have, first name? Now we can just say $sign and then first name in the parentheses. A lot less to type. All right? It's an alias. That's all it is. So again, this line right here says now, since we've got this line up here, since we got the line right here, it says it's the same thing as if we said var email address 1 equal document.getElementById, then in parentheses email address dot value. Does that make sense? because you're going to forget it anyway. I'm sorry, you will. Everybody does. But when you look at it long enough and you use it over and over and over again, it starts to sink in as far as what it means. All right? All right. Yeah. So a function, as it says, is a block of code that is called. It's also known as invoking the function. A function can require parameters be passed into it. All right. They're typically referred to as parameters. All right. Depends on the book you read. In most books, they will call number 1 and number 2 here, they will call these parameters. And down here, N1, N2, they will call those arguments. Some books call them both parameters. Some books call them both arguments. It's really not that big a thing. All right, it depends on the book you read. So I showed you a function expression. That's where we assign the value of a variable to a function. You can also write a function like this. Look at the difference. Well, where is it? They have one here? No, they don't. You can write a function, we'll see it a little later, where you don't take, if you're calling it once and never calling it again, you don't even need to set it equal to a variable. You'll just say function equal. You'll see this in a bit. That's called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. You're not assigning it to a variable. All right. So, function, you need the keyword function, the name of your function, and any parameters the function needs. I already showed you this in the calculator program. Again, here's one, here's another one. This one has no parameters in it. So you have to make sure when you call it, there are no parameters in it. All right. Here's a function, one we just looked at. There is something passed in. That ID right there, all right, is the same thing as that ID right there. But you are passing in an ID right here. You are passing that in. And what you are saying right here is, hey, I'm writing a function right here that says every time you get document.getElement by ID with an ID, we don't want to do that because it's too much work. So every time we use a $, then in parentheses and in single or double quotes, some kind of an ID, we want you to replace that with this. It wouldn't hurt to never use this and always do it like this. But people always screw up the caseness. They put ID with a big I and a big D, etc. Just do it. It's just natural. So again, doing that allows you to call things like this. So here's a function with multiple parameters, and it's got a return statement. All right. So notice we are creating in here a new variable called tax. Can you all see this? This is what's called a local variable. It didn't exist before. It's a local variable. It's local to this function. So even though we're returning it, once we return it, tax itself is dead. It doesn't exist anymore. All right. So we're passing in a subtotal and a tax rate. And we're saying the tax is that subtotal times the tax rate. Then we're formatting that to 2 decimal places and we're returning it. So what you can see right here is 85, 5%. So it should come back here and say 85 times 5%, 425. All right. Now this is a little confusing. It says, in contrast to a function expression, a function declaration is hoisted to the top of the scope that contains it. This means that it doesn't have to be coded before the statements that called it. All right. So that means that I can call, I already showed you it, believe it or not, in here. I'm calling these functions, would you agree? I'm calling add2, diff2, prod2. I'm calling them, they haven't been declared yet. They're not declared until down here. But it hoisted them up. So it made the system know, oh, they're going to be someplace else in the program. In some programming languages, you must take these functions that are being called, they must literally be above in your code where you call them. All right, they must physically be placed above, not in JavaScript. All right. All right, I've told you some of this with local and global variables. When you use strict, stuff changes. If you don't use strict, if you don't do that, this is, to me, this is weird, in my opinion. So let's say I didn't use strict. Now I've got a routine in here, I've got a function. Okay? And I say var tax equal. It says tax is a local variable. If I don't put the word var there, it creates a global variable. If I don't put var or let, if I just say tax, it says, the hell is that? And it makes it global. You don't want to do that. That's such bad programming practice. All right? So with use strict, you couldn't do that. But let's say we did use strict. That's a local variable because it's only the scope of it is inside of this routine. Does that make sense to everyone? Whether it is var or let. All right? Here is a global variable. This example that's on top now. Why? Because we put it right at the top of the program. It's not declared inside of any routine. So it's global. The advantage of global variables, you don't have to pass them back and forth. That's the advantage. The disadvantage of global variables is they can have what are called side effects. All right? And what's a side effect? That means that any function can change the value of the variable, even functions that maybe shouldn't. Okay? All right. That's pretty much what they're saying in here. In general, it says it's better to pass variables from one function to the other as opposed to making them global. The other thing, too, is when you make them global, all right, when you do make them global, they last forever, and maybe you don't even need them to last forever. All right? All right, strict mode. If you need more about strict mode than I've given you, it's in here. But they do say best coding practices, use local variables whenever possible. No, change that. You don't have to write in your book, but it should be use the let keyword to declare all variables. And that's not even true. If you are declaring a variable that you know will never, ever change, it should be a const. It should. All right? Declare variables that are used in a function at the start of the function. You can actually put them anywhere. That's bad practice. All right, put it at the start. So it says strict mode must go at the top before any other code. When you're coding in strict mode, if you forget to use the word var or let and you misspell it, you'll get an error. All right? And it won't work with earlier versions of IE, but then again, what does? All right. It's 8:56. It's going a little slower than I thought. That's still fine because I've already gone over pretty much the first program of the two that I want to go over with you. All right. So it's 8:56. Let's come back, please, at 9:10. And when we come back, we're going to pick it up on page 126. We've got about 10 pages left in the chapter. By 10 o'clock, we will have the rest of the chapter done, and we will go over the other program. I'm going to send you both of these during the break. So take a break. 9:10, please.